Hello, nice to meet you. Last time I mentioned that acknowledging your child's disability is more important than the cause or diagnosis. This time, over the next 2 sessions, I would like to discuss what it specifically means to acknowledge your child's disability. In fact, everyone wishes for their child to be smart and outstanding, someone they can be proud of anywhere. I am no different. Especially when it comes to developmental disabilities or autism, which you may have never heard of, it is perfectly natural to feel confused and find it difficult to accept. In such a situation, when your child has a disability, simply saying, just accept it, is really difficult because it's not something that can be done just because you want to. And as you go through life, it's something you experience and realize over time. In fact, I will be sharing a lot of my personal stories today, and I hesitated quite a bit about whether to share them or not. I wondered if my personal stories would actually be helpful. The reason I decided to make this video is that I hope that by sharing stories from my personal life, parents who are currently raising young children might receive some help by recognizing their child's disability a little earlier and more healthily. It could benefit both the family and the child. Now, let me talk about what it means to acknowledge a child's disability. In the previous session, we discussed cases where disabilities are not acknowledged, but even when a child's disability is recognized, there seem to be various ways it manifests afterward. The first is not disclosing it. There are cases where a child has a disability, but it is not disclosed to the outside world. The second is that it is disclosed, and they diligently go for treatment. However, the focus is on fixing the child. Of course, when it comes to treatment, the thought of wanting to fix them is inevitable. But if the strong desire to fix the child comes in without first accepting and understanding the child as they are, the child can become quite stressed, as is often said. We've experienced such cases too, but when such a situation arises, initially when the child is young, they can't particularly resist, so it might pass. But over time, side effects can occur. They might develop resentment or become very rebellious during adolescence. So what I want to convey today is that instead of focusing on fixing the child, we should acknowledge that we need to change ourselves. Literally, acknowledgement means accepting the child's shortcomings and changing ourselves and the environment to help with those shortcomings. In my experience, in the case of developmental disabilities, it is not a process of changing the child, but rather a process of changing myself. I believe that the beginning of this is a change in perspective towards the child. It is also a change in perspective towards life. As I mentioned last time, when a child has a developmental disability, there is initially disappointment and despair, but as I mentioned earlier, there is also a strong determination to definitely treat the child. This is, of course, not a wrong thought. As I mentioned earlier, it seems to be the case when the thought of treating them is so strong that one only thinks about fixing the child. Therefore, I believe that the starting point of accepting the child's disability is a change in perspective from wanting to fix the child to changing oneself. It means that instead of having a child who moves according to my will and my way, I need to understand the child more and change myself as needed. And it means focusing on how to change the environment to meet those needs. So, I will now share my personal life. And as I mentioned earlier, the reason I'm sharing this is that there have been several turning points in my life's journey. And I believe these moments have helped me to accept my child more as they are. Therefore, I would like to briefly share my life story. The first turning point for me was realizing that despite the belief that you reap what you sow, there are things you cannot achieve no matter how hard you try. This is such an obvious statement, but actually realizing this in life seems to be a different issue. In my case, it feels like my life is divided into before and after knowing that my child has a disability. Before knowing that my child has a disability, my life motto seemed to be, if you try hard, you can succeed. As I talk about this, an old memory suddenly comes to mind. Back in my 20s, I briefly tutored, and one of my students once came to me after an exam and said something. The student asked, "You can't understand failing an exam because of being in bad condition, can you?" That's what they asked me. Even now, when I think about it, that question seems to have had some significance for me. I remember being very taken aback because I had never grown up with that kind of thinking. But now, that friend probably thinks that if you're in bad condition, you can fail an exam. That's why they must have asked me that. When that friend asked me, I think they saw me as someone who wouldn't understand them. I was someone who strongly believed that you reap what you sow. I wasn't exceptionally good at studying, but I went to college, got a job, and earned a degree through further studies. all of which I believed were the results of my efforts. Of course, from a worldly perspective or in striving for success, there is nothing wrong with making an effort. I also have lived diligently in my own way, so I don't think there's any problem with that. However, as I live my life, I realize that not everything turns out as you work for it. I also came to realize that things don't always go as I wish, and I think that moment was when I found out that my child has a disability. At that time, when they said my child has autism, didn't I try to find out in every possible way how to fix it, just like any other parent would? But it wasn't for a very long time. After diligently researching and trying for about 1 or 2 years, I realized that it wasn't something that could be completely cured or treated, and that there wasn't much we could do with the medical technology available at the time. As a result, I came to think, there's not much I can do about this. So it could be described as giving up or despair. But after going through this situation, I moved on to the next stage, which was that once I let go, my life shifted from being self-directed to relying on the Lord. I will briefly talk about my faith now, and as I mentioned before, after studying in the US and returning to Korea when our child was 3 years old, didn't I tell you that he was diagnosed with a developmental disability? At that time, we were attending a Catholic church. So even after returning to Korea, we went to church. But since our child was making various noises, people kept looking at us during the Mass. I completely understand why they were looking, why we brought a noisy child to the Mass. Even though the parents are right there, why don't they stop him and just let him be? I think they were looking at us with those thoughts in mind. If my child didn't have a disability, I would probably have looked at a child making noise during Mass too. At that time, if there had been a place where I could leave my child, I would have left him there and attended the Mass. But there was nowhere to leave him. So I went to Mass with my child. But because they kept giving us those looks, it became difficult to continue attending Mass. So we couldn't keep going to the church. During that time, an acquaintance from the US mentioned that the church they attended also ran a private elementary school that offered inclusive education, and they encouraged us to visit that church. The reason was that to enroll in that school, you had to attend the church. But as someone who attended a Catholic church, the idea of going to a different church just to enroll our child was initially unacceptable, so I naturally refused. However, both my acquaintance and my wife suggested that we should at least give it a try, so we decided to give it a try. At that time, I had just finished my studies in the United States and was probably filled with the thought of striving for worldly success. However, as soon as we returned to Korea, my child was diagnosed with a developmental disorder. The following month, my wife underwent surgery for cancer, and the month after that, one of my brothers passed away from cancer. In just 2 or 3 months, 3 major events occurred, and I thought, wow, misfortune really does come all at once. At that time, there was nothing I could control about any of it. However, I don't think I shed tears or anything like that in that situation. Focusing on solving the problems, I didn't even have the luxury to emotionally process my situation. It was during that time that I went to the church. When I went to the church for the first time, my child usually doesn't separate easily from me, but the volunteer told me to just leave the child and go attend the service. Of course, we were worried, but they said they've taken care of many children like ours and know well, so even if the child cries at first, they will be fine soon. They told us not to worry and to go attend the service. So my wife and I went in together. I think that day was the first time my wife and I attended a service together, whether it was a Mass or a service, since our second child was born. Because of that, we were able to focus on the service. The verse quoted in the sermon at that time was, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I was already familiar with this verse, so it wasn't new to me. But as soon as I heard it, that day, I burst into tears. I think I was suppressing the difficulties I was experiencing at the time, and that verse seemed to touch my heart. To my recollection, it was the first time I cried in almost 30 years, since I last cried when I was very young. In fact, I attended church during high school and received baptism when I got married, attending the cathedral, but looking back now, did I truly take my faith seriously? When I think about it, I don't think I did. In high school, it felt more like a student activity. I attended the cathedral because my wife had been going there before we got married, and she somewhat insisted that I go with her. Of course, I tried to attend diligently, but I don't think I had a strong faith. I remember contemplating whether I should be baptized even though I didn't have such faith, and when I attended church in the US, there were moments where you kneel and pray. But I couldn't even kneel at those times because I lacked sincerity. I was the type of person who couldn't act unless something resonated with me, but after that day, I think I started to take my faith more seriously. At that time, I started attending church with my family, and I thought that I should unconditionally obey whatever the church instructed. I also diligently studied the Bible and read it a lot on my own. Additionally, as I mentioned earlier, there were volunteers at the church who took care of the children, allowing me to fully participate in the service. As a result, my wife and I began to recover spiritually and mentally, which indirectly allowed us to approach our child with more ease, and our perspective on our children started to change gradually. The changed perspective at this time was that if I had previously viewed our child from a worldly perspective, from this period onward, I began to see our child from God's perspective. I think this was an important turning point. When I mentioned that my child has a disability, I heard various things from those around me, and one of the things I heard was that many parents of children with disabilities often say they wish to live just one day longer than their child. Of course, I wondered how difficult it must be and how much they must love their child to say such things, but on the other hand, it seemed so obvious that my child would outlive me, so I questioned whether that was really the right thing to say, and it didn't resonate with me much. It also seemed like they considered their child to be an enormous burden. So those words didn't really resonate with me, but what did resonate was the story about a meeting in the sky. It's not a real story, of course. A meeting was held in the sky, and the topic of the meeting was about sending a precious child into the world who would need a lot of help. So they needed to find special parents to help this child. This story, on the other hand, resonated with me in a meaningful way. The reason is that the idea of sending such a precious child who needs help, and that truly special parents are needed to care for this child, seemed to resonate more with me. Instead of thinking of my child as my own and trying to fix them, it became an opportunity to change my mindset to one where I do my best to help the precious child entrusted to me by the Lord and leave the rest to Him. At that time, I also started reading a lot of religious books, and the first book I read was Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey. I think the reason this book caught my eye first was probably because I was very disappointed with God at the time. After this, I read many books by authors like Helen Owen and C.S. Lewis, and there was one common thing I felt from them. It was that suffering is a disguised blessing. Many people might say, since there is already suffering, isn't it inevitable to live with such thoughts to find comfort in that situation? I thought the same way. But then, what does it matter? That's what I started to think. I resonated with the idea that the difficulties given to me could be blessings, and if that could make my life and my family's life more positive, then that's a good thing. The issue is whether such thoughts just don't occur. It seems like that. Even when I try to have such thoughts, it's not easy to do so. But when those thoughts do come in a way, it's something to be thankful for. And clearly, compared to before, my perspective on life has broadened, and my approach and understanding of hardships have expanded. In fact, our family was led to the Lord because of our second child's disability. And I believe it became an opportunity for our family to become closer rather than being absorbed in each of our own lives. If it weren't for our second child's disability, I would have been absorbed in work or outside activities. My wife might have returned to her job, and we might have pushed and stressed our first and second children a lot to make them successful. Another thing I came to see through words and meditation in relation to this suffering is the book of Job. In fact, the story of Job is quite difficult. It's about how Job, who did nothing wrong and was even called righteous by God, was subjected to suffering to challenge Satan, and I just couldn't really understand it. Of course, later in the very last chapter, Job makes a confession saying, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." From this perspective, it also became an opportunity for me to think about my own children. Even Job went through this, and God allowed our Jesus, who was without any sin, to be crucified and die. Then I start to wonder what must have been the feelings of Mary, the mother of our Jesus. And then gradually the questions begin to change. How should I accept my child's disability? What meaning does it have? How can I reveal God's glory? What exactly is God's glory? I find myself continuously asking these kinds of questions, and I think I made a lot of effort to find answers to them. If my child didn't have a disability, I probably wouldn't have thought about these kinds of questions. Even if I did, I probably would have done so superficially. So these questions came to me not as abstract, but rather more concretely. But just because I ask these questions and have these thoughts, does that mean my life is suddenly always pleasing to God? That's not the case, and since I was working, my life didn't change that much. However, as I mentioned last time, my family left for Canada first, and I lived as a goose father for about 2 years, which brought many difficulties. Financially, maintaining 2 households became a burden, and I was troubled by questions like how long I should continue living as a goose father, whether my family should return, or if I should move to Canada. If I go, what will I do for a living? These were some of the many difficult issues I faced, but there wasn't much I could do. So I started to pray. Being alone led me to this. At that time, I prayed by writing, and I believe this method greatly helped me organize my thoughts and find answers to the many questions I had. So even now, I pray in that way. And what I remember is Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke. It's a passage that I've heard many times before and is often quoted in sermons, so I was very familiar with it. Be a good neighbor who helps those in need. That was the kind of message it conveyed. I also interpreted it as a call for me as a Samaritan to help those in trouble. However, during my meditation that day, I felt that I was not the Samaritan, but rather the person who had been attacked by robbers, and my child with a disability appeared to be the Samaritan, just as Jesus came as the Samaritan to save me, who was spiritually dead. I thought I was indeed the Samaritan helping my child, truly playing the role of Jesus, but instead, it seemed that my child was bearing the cross in the image of Jesus to save me, who was spiritually dead. I don't know how much I literally cried that day. When I thought that my child was bearing the cross because of me, I felt so sorry for my child that I remember crying my heart out. Since then, instead of trying to fix my child, I sometimes think of my child as the image of Jesus trying to fix my own flaws. Of course, I often forget and live my life though. And as I raised my child with a disability, the various meanings of the Bible that I had only understood abstractly became more concrete and experiential. As I mentioned before, I have a personality that finds it hard to believe without understanding, so I had many difficulties in my faith life. It was because questions like what faith is and where it comes from always followed me, and I couldn't easily find the answers. I thought it was too abstract, and even now, I still have many such questions. However, while raising a child with disabilities, I have come to experience what prayer is, and concepts like faith, obedience, miracles, love, glory, and worship have become more tangible to me through my life experiences. To speak about prayer first, of course, I pray for my child's disability to be healed. However, I don't think that just because I pray, everything will miraculously happen. Some might say, can you pray with such doubt? I consider it as expressing my wishes, and whether it will be fixed or not is up to God. And I consider that to be prayer. A similar example is the story of Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians. Apostle Paul fervently prayed for the thorn in his flesh to be removed, but God did not remove it and instead told him, "My grace is sufficient for you." At that time, Apostle Paul probably accepted that as an answer to his prayer. Similarly, I would be very grateful if I were healed, but even if I am not, I accept it as the Lord's will. Even though my child has a disability, I accept it as the best life given by the Lord, although it is indeed very difficult. Living life to the fullest, even in the midst of that, I believe that is obedience and faith. If my child were successful and I were also doing well in the world, would I have been able to think this way? I ask myself this question. People usually say that when everything you pray for comes true, it's a miracle. But I think that accepting and being grateful for things even in difficult times and living life that way is actually a greater miracle than any other. If you pray for money and receive money, pray for honor and receive honor, pray for power and receive power, then you would likely live gratefully and call it a miracle, even if it wasn't through Jesus. But if you receive none of those things and are in the midst of such suffering, yet live accepting it with gratitude, I think that is a greater miracle than any other. In the Bible, it seems that the disciples did not have worldly success. Nevertheless, they were people who kept their faith even unto martyrdom. I think that might actually be the miracle. Also, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus speaks about the greatest commandment, saying that loving God and loving your neighbor are the greatest commandments. Whether one loves God is something only the individual can truly know. Even for me, I don't quite grasp concretely what it means to say that I love God. Is it really love? If I just keep saying I love God, because I always have these thoughts. He also spoke about loving your neighbor. at the same time. However, loving your neighbor seems to have a bit more substance. So I thought that perhaps helping people with disabilities and their families might be a way of loving my neighbor. Therefore, I am loving God. It's quite embarrassing to say that I love my neighbor and thus love God, but nonetheless, I am trying to live in that direction. I share this, albeit with some embarrassment, as my small way of practicing love. In 2009, while I was living apart from my family, I visited Vancouver briefly in the summer to see them. Usually, it's because I have trouble adjusting to the time difference, but around 4 in the morning, I woke up with a strong feeling that I should write something down. At that time, I noted down what I believed was a vision given by God. What I wrote down at that time is as follows: so that the precious lives given by God can live fully, realizing within a community of love that both people with disabilities and those without are the same beings living by God's love. Engage in a ministry where people understand that it's not about non-disabled people helping those with disabilities, but about living in a relationship where they help and love each other. It felt like I was hearing these words, though I didn't actually hear them. They were in my heart, so I wrote them down in my notebook. At that time, I didn't really understand what it specifically meant, and if I had to connect it to something, I thought it might be related to my involvement in establishing a welfare foundation when I was in Korea. I just thought it might be connected to that. But when I first started this ministry in 2013, and now looking back in 2023, I see that the vision I wrote down back then is being realized now. In fact, I believe that this message was a great source of strength for me to start. There was nothing, so how did I start it with such confidence? Looking back now, I don't quite understand, but I think that at the time, I was given that kind of faith. Also, when I look at the many teachers who serve our disabled individuals at Here and Now, I always think, wow, the Lord is sending us such precious teachers, teachers filled with love. So, whenever I see our teachers, I am always filled with immense gratitude. I think that the way our disabled individuals and their families live, along with the presence of such teachers, must be pleasing to God. And I also feel that this is, indeed, the glory of God. While attending church and worshiping is certainly considered worship, I also believe that this way of life itself is a form of worship. If I didn't have a child with a disability, I probably would have continued working at a company. And with that kind of life, I think it would have been difficult to live with these thoughts and in this direction. Nevertheless, if someone were to tempt me with money, fame, and power, I feel like I might easily give in. So perhaps the Lord won't give me such temptations, because it is said that only trials we can handle are given to us. I don't think I can be that kind of great person. So I am grateful that it is not the case. As I get older, I feel that things I was grateful for turn into resentment, and things I resented turn into gratitude. In that sense, I believe that accepting a child's disability is faith, obedience, and a miracle. Next time, I plan to talk about the mindset of parents regarding the recognition of a child's disability, in continuation of today's discussion. See you next time. Thank you for watching today.